Hello, and welcome to a special session of Chai on the Moon. This is one of the series where we have been talking about various aspects of science, society, and the future of humans on the moon. And today we are actually having a panel which I hope it's going to be the first of several in thinking about the future of the moon within the context of the global south. And so this is just the beginning of a conversation to think about how these kind of issues might bring in the global south, might impact the global south, and also what kind of voices are needed to think about these questions. And I have three guests with me here today. I will be moderating this session. And so I thought, let's start with introductions. And so, Dr. Shastri, please, if you can introduce yourself and your connection to interest on the moon and also in terms of the global south.
So I've been an astrophysicist for over 4 decades, and I've specialized in the physics of giant black holes in distant galaxies. I'm based in Bengaluru. I believe that scientific thinking is for everyone, which sort of goes hand in hand with striving for knowledge as a public good. And indeed, our cosmos is also a public good. And so I really resonate with the central concern of this conversation, and it's a real pleasure to be here.
Okay. Uh, Dr. Oyewole, if you can actually say a few words about your introduction as well and your connection, Dr. Samuel.
Okay, thank you so much. Samuel Oyewole from the African Center for the Study of the United States and Ocean Region Program at the University of Pretoria here in South Africa. My research revolves around space policy and politics, military and strategy study, and international relation. I'm also interested in science and tech policy. So basically, my research revolves around the politics, the diplomacy, and the geopolitics and the economy around the socio-economic of space exploration. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. Venugopal from South, located in South Africa. Can you also introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. So it's really good to be here. Glad to be part of this first of many conversations, hopefully. So I am from India as well, currently based in Cape Town, South Africa, at the Office of Astronomy for Development, which is one of the offices of the International Astronomical Union, where we look at the intersections between science and society and how astronomy and space and related subjects can actually tangibly benefit people. My interest in the subject comes from my background, which is in space science and technology and telecommunications. So, outside of my day job in astronomy, I deal a lot with people who work within the space industry, where I've come across a range of opinions on this matter. So, I'm quite excited to get into the discussion.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And I should mention that we were also supposed to have Dr. Diaz from Brazil, but as it turns out, he's a lawyer, and he had a last minute. He had a call up for a court hearing, and so he's going to participate in later conversations. And Dr. Bozina Welburn, who's a professor at Smith College, she also couldn't make it at the last minute. So we will have a broader panel next time. My name is Salman Hamid, and I'm a professor of integrated science and humanities at Hampshire College. I'm an astronomer by training. I'm originally from Pakistan, but I also founded Kainat Studios, and where these conversations are taking place. So, with these introductions out of the place, I wanted to give a little bit of caveats about the word global south, because this is a broad catch all term. And I think when we are talking about these things, it's good to know, that what kind of weaknesses are there as well in the way we define terms. But also, there is a power in that as well, in some of the ambiguity. So we are not including a country like China, for example, in the global south for this particular purpose. And part of the reason is because China is one of the major players of going to the moon, alongside with the United States. But in some sense, the way we are thinking about global south are low to middle income countries that may or may not have aspirations or space programs to go to the moon. India is a great example, which actually has been to the moon, is planning on going to the moon again, but it still is considered as part of the global south. Whereas Nigeria, for example, actually, Nigeria also has a space program. It also wants to go to the moon, but hasn't been there. So there are these variations, but I think one of the things that we want to focus on, especially regarding the global south, is that it actually covers the majority of the world population. And so when thinking about the future of the moon, I think we want to bring all the voices or most of the voices of the world, and not just for those that have the means and the resources to go to the moon. And so, how do we think about these issues? I think that is where we are headed to. So, I think that's a good starting point for the panel here as well. And I will just throw in a very general statement that next couple of years, we are going to see human presence on the moon. There's a likelihood from the US or from China. There are already a lot of private space missions to the moon that are taking place, and in the next couple of years, that are going to be taking place with increasing frequency. And so we know that there is going to be potentially, like, the moon is going to set the stage for further human presence in potentially in the broader solar system. So from your perspective of global south, and it could be from your national, regional, or any other aspect, what are some of the concerns, or if you think a place of promise that you have about human and or robotic presence on the moon? So it's a broad question. I will leave it up, whoever wants to jump ahead in this conversation.
Should I go?
Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Shastri.
So I think I'm the oldest in this panel here. I was born the year after Sputnik was launched. And I vividly recall how iconic Sputnik was, of the euphoria of that emerged, how science embodied the promise of a future of happiness and abundance for all, and so on. And in fact, India's science and technology policy was also passed in Parliament that year. We are in a very different situation today, with humanity confronting collective crises, of which the crisis of inequity, of public health, and also the environment, of course, are perhaps the most salient. And they are perpetrated by the global minority, mostly located in the global north, but also located in the global south to some extent, by sort of inspired by the consumerism perpetrated by the global north. And so, seen in this context, there are many concerns with what is playing out in terms of exploration of the moon and exploration of the cosmos in general. So, I would highlight firstly space exploration as happening in a nationalistic competitive framework, with the assumption that those who have the technology have the ownership and therefore the decision making authority. And secondly, these assumptions are being taken for granted without any kind of deconstruction. So, whether it is deconstruction of the notion of nationalistic competitive framework, or deconstruction of the notion of ownership of technology, actually the ownership of technology is the way it is because it's an aftermath of extractive colonialism and settler colonialism, which is what enabled some nations to possess technology as against others and so on. But that deconstruction is just not happening. And thirdly, because of the spirit of institutions like NASA and, in fact, India's ISRO as public institutions is also being eroded. Profit maximization for the few is what is gaining the upper hand. So, rather than digest and critique the big picture in the global south too, at least I see this in India, just as consumerism on earth is being pushed as being the sort of ultimate aspirational value, even space is being artificially commodified with the explicit encouragement, in fact, of space agencies like ISRO. So rather than nurture critical thinking, which can enable questions such as how should taxpayer funds be spent, what should be the priorities, and how should they evolve, knowledge creation for whom, there is a push instead to just sort of copy paste the value framework from the global north, which is quite transparently now in the direction of profit maximization. So there is a need, I think, for people's voices to gain collective strength. The possibility that governments and national agencies would truly represent people's interest or humanity's interest is sort of evaporated.
Thank you so much. Oh, and I guess, I mean, one of the things that you've mentioned, I mean, it's about uh, how do we get to values. I mean, it sounds like, I mean, like, that, I mean, you mentioned sort of like a lot of emphasis is on profit making and so on and so forth. uh, it centers back to this question about, okay, so if we are going to the moon or to space in general, what type of things are we centering should be the priority, right? I mean, I think and how do we get to that? I mean, whose voices play a role in creating those values? Okay, anybody else, Samuel or Ram?
Okay.
I can.
Thank you.
Ram, go ahead.
Okay, sure. Thank you. So, since you mentioned values, I actually wanted to add something on that point. The world that we live in is driven so much by narratives, right? For better or worse, that's how reality works. Unfortunately, at the moment, and in this context, even though it's global north countries currently that are leaders in space exploration, and there aren't many global south countries who have the capabilities to go to the moon, I think there is kind of a narrative being pushed by some of the countries in the global north, which is sort of spilling over now to global south countries, even being used to convince governments and convince people. And I think it sort of rests on two pillars. One is that the idea of abundance. So people are arguing that there are plenty of resources available outside of Earth, the moon, asteroids, wherever. And the second sort of concept here is that the idea that as humanity we have the right to exploit these resources. Um, and it talks to what Prajval was saying about the roots of the industry being connected to colonialism, and there's lots of people critiquing this and so on. But unfortunately, now more and more it's being embedded in even in global south countries, in the space agencies in global south countries, that we must extract more and more resources in order for economies for our countries to keep growing. And when we run out of resources here on earth, we have to find them elsewhere. So it's almost a situation where global south countries are being told, not in so many words, that either you join us, we have a seat at the table for you, either you join us in this sort of endeavor to exploit resources, or you risk being left behind. So for me, the first first step in this journey is to get people to think about alternatives, I guess, and not to fall for this artificial competition and need that is being created by the companies and the big agencies in the global north countries.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that's, I mean, it's a weird dynamic because, right, I mean, because it falls into this category of that if we don't join in, then you're going to even fall even more behind.
Yeah.
And in order to join in, the framework to join is the
Right.
same that has been set by the global north in some sense,
Yeah.
which is often driven by profits. And so, it gets the dynamic gets very tricky, right? And how to break that. Sorry, Samuel, you wanted to say
Yeah,
something.
thank you so much for this. I think why talking about global south, I think there's a need for us to realize the fact that countries that make up global south are not homogeneous in capacity and capability to access and explore space generally and the moon in specific, I mean, particularly in this context. We have some global south countries like India. You said we are excluding China, but sometimes China finds itself as called global south for convenience purpose or for geopolitical reason. But we have countries in the global south that can be clearly classified as among the great powers when we are talking about space. They have capability to reach space on their own and to launch as far as the moon. And India is an example. Below that, we have countries that are emerging space power, those that are very close to them in capability, either in time of grand infrastructure, like countries like South Africa, or in time of certain other capability, countries like Brazil, Argentina, Egypt to some extent, and some other countries like UAE and all, the rest of them have some considerable capability that qualify them as regional space power in their own sphere of influence, and on a global scale, it offer them leverage in dealing with a major space player. Below that, we have the necess play, the necess space player. Countries with just one or two satellites that are still struggling to learn how to adopt or adapt this satellite into their day-to-day life. These are countries that are maybe possibly launch their first satellite in 5 years or less than 10 years, and still have a long way to go in time of space support technology. For them, issue of distance space exploration is still a distant future things and dream for many of these countries. So their interest in space exploration, their interest on issue of the moon is totally different from countries that are in the middle or at the middle, that can be considered as emerging space power or regional space power, and countries that are leading space power like in the global south context, country like India. So interest vary from one country to another. Again, we have countries that are aspiring space player. This country at the current state, they don't have anything that we can actually identify as a space major space asset. Many of these countries don't even have satellite, but some of them have ambition to establish space agency. Some of them have future ambition to launch satellite of their own, or either mini satellite or CubeSat and so on. So these are aspiring space nations. And for them, the interest in the moon is too far flung for them to be thinking about. So based on capability. And then we have countries that are yet to display any significant interest in space in the global south. And with these dynamics, we have diversity of interest and diversity of capability. And that diversity have to be taken into consideration in any discourse on global south interest and position on the moon. Because many of these countries majority of the so-called global south country or countries that fall into this classification still consider space moon exploration, their interest in the moon as a long-term objective, not 10 years, 20 years for many of these countries. Compared to countries like the US, Russia, China, that see it as something that they can achieve in the next 10 years. Some of them in the next in this decade, before the end of this decade, many of these countries have targets to achieve on the moon. But for many of these global south countries, for majority of these countries, it's not an ambition, it's not even an objective in the next 20 years. It's not in their long-term plan. So, in this context, how do we break this gap? And diplomacy offer this opportunity. How can this country partner with established and emerging space players to advance their interest in space and on the moon? And we can see the network of partnership that are emerging. Pro-US Artemis Accord signatories show us pattern of how global south countries are pursuing their diplomatic strategy or means to advance their interest in space and specifically on the moon. A number of countries have signed this Artemis Accord in Africa, in Asia, as well as in South America or Latin America. As we can see in Africa, countries like Nigeria, Rwanda, Senegal have signed this Artemis Accord, which shows their lineage and it also shows their geopolitical alignment with the United States on this matter. And question have been asked: what's the benefit of this of signing this Artemis Accord for these countries? On the other side, we have seen countries that have considered the Chinese, Russian space international lunar space project as a considerable option, a strategic option for them to advance their future interest. Some of them are not immediate, but to advance their interest in space. And we can see countries like South Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Senegal, Panama, Venezuela, and some other countries signing this. But this also show orientation in terms of their foreign and security policy, foreign and defense policy. Their space strategy is aligning with their foreign policy and defense policy, which is also significant in global South identity. Because global South identity can be traced back to the colonial period and the need for most of these decolonial or post-colonial states to stand aloof in the Cold War rivalry between the East and the West, which is also similar to what we are experiencing or what is evolving in recent years. So, in this kind of context, we can see countries that are trying to play this dual role, benefiting from both sides in this context. And I will give you the case earlier before now. I thought it was only one country, but I discovered that there are now two. Panama and Senegal have signed both
Yeah.
Artemis Accord and then the Chinese-led lunar exploration, offering them the opportunity to benefit from both sides. This country may actually provide a roadmap for many global south countries to follow suit in coming years. And if you look at the space capacity and interest of these two countries, these are countries that are just aspiring or early stage NASA space player. Because Senegal only launched its first satellite maybe one year ago or so. So still a recent space player that still have a lot to learn. For them, moon is not the immediate objective. It's not even intermediate interest. It's a long-term interest. But for them, they see countries that they can partner with to achieve that long-term interest, no matter the small objective they can pursue with this, within this immediate range. So the need to identify or to appreciate the diversity in global south is important. Diversity in interest and diversity in capability in space is very important. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you for bringing this up because two things. When you were also describing the different categories of capabilities in some sense, I was also thinking about a country like Pakistan, for example, which is deeply connected to China. And so, and in fact, Pakistan has also sent sort of like a satellite to the moon, but through China, right? So, I mean, so you also have this element of much closer alliance, much closer collaboration which can also take you there. But I think what you bring up is a really I think it's one of the key points. One is that, or 2 points I would say. One is that on the one hand, space is also seen as a road to progress and essential for the country's infrastructure and things like that. And for that, you need alliance, you need help from NASA or from the Chinese space program and things like that, which then gets tied to Artemis or for the Chinese lunar research station, right? So it's not that you are immediately going to the moon or thinking about the moon, but the way you form an alliance, even for more practical purposes or for defense purposes, that gets tied to the longer term lunar strategy of either the US or China or whatever block that you come in. And, and so how do you balance that out, sort of like, that in terms of the value question. So this is what we are trying to say. Okay, so on the one hand, there are these deep geopolitical, practical concerns that are aligned with the country's needs. But then you also have to think about the values, and that those may or may not combine together. And so I would pivot to another aspect of that. One thing, are there any analogies that you can think of other than space? So, space we are thinking about. Are there other any analogies on sort of like non-space related that you think can help us to think about the sort of like the future of the moon, or these kind of alliances or these kind of concerns of countries? If anybody has any analogies, and I know analogies are not perfect, but some examples or things like that. I mean, I was thinking sort of like, yeah, go ahead, Ram.
I was going to say, I guess the oceans, right? So countries own part of the marine territories. I don't know how many kilometers out from the coast, but the rest is actually high seas that no one owns. And same for Antarctica, no one owns. Well, technically, no one owns Antarctica, but we see how things are changing, both in the Arctic and the Antarctic, very similar to what's happening in space in terms of lunar exploration. So I think we have the models and frameworks uh, that have sort of worked in practical terms for more than 50 years or so. But I wonder how well they could be adapted for space, and in the current geopolitical context, um, who's even accountable to anyone anymore?
You are looking in my direction. No, I'm just saying right now because I'm in the US. Like, some of the political issues get blamed on sort of like, on the US right now. Right, but I should mention. I mean, the Antarctica Treaty is an interesting one because that is not a UN based treaty. It's more like it is an out sort of like a result of the Cold War, right? Like, the way it was framed and the way multiple countries had laid claims to it, including Argentina, Australia, South Africa, and others. uh, but it's, I mean, it has worked miraculously, I would say, but it is an uneasy alliance, and not from the UN. And the high seas treaty, or sort of like seabed, that's a really another interesting one, which is under a lot of pressure to change. So yeah, I mean, we have to think about those things. Any other comments regarding that, Sam or Prajval? Yeah.
I was going to mention the historical
Yeah.
parallels. I
Yeah.
think it's also important to derive lessons from history. And certainly settler colonialism, extractive colonialism, and their aftermath is something that we already saw play out. And I see very, very close parallels here, that I go put a post on some spot in the moon and then it's mine, sort of thing. And I think the second lesson, which is not unconnected to this first lesson, is the environmental crisis which confronts us. So the fact that a global minority, mostly from again from the global north or located in the global south, but inspired by the consumerism perpetuated by the global north, has made a mess of our habitat. It threatens all of humanity, and that should also be a very strong lesson when we chart the path towards space exploration. So even the physicist who won the Nobel Prize for discoveries of exoplanets, Michel Mayor, has added his voice to this declaration that there is no planet B. And of course, the Carl Sagan metaphor of our little blue dot continues to be sort of ultimately evocative. But on the positive side, there is, just like the Antarctica thing, there is the International Space Station, which was a very interesting experiment of collaborative knowledge creation and also international collaboration, which fostered relationships sort of beyond geopolitics. And it is kind of disturbing that this idea is being stifled. I mean, no, by now we should have had an international space station that was a collective effort of all countries, but instead it's a kind of an idea that is eroding. And the reason is clear. It is this supremacy that is being gained by the idea of profiteering for the few, which does not square with the sort of outcomes or the spirit even of the International Space Station. So,
Yeah, and I should mention that I mean, International Space Station is a really interesting example because even after Ukraine, the Russian, I mean, there was tensions about that, but there is a Russian module on the space station, and the way it was structured, the whole space station was that it is dependent on one part is dependent on another, that you
mm,
cannot simply just
yeah,
walk away from it, and I think that was by
right.
design. At the same
Yes,
time, coming to the current crisis, China was excluded. China
yes,
wanted to be part of the International Space Station, but it was the US that vetoed its presence on it. And that led to China building its own space station.
yes.
Uh, so I mean, I think the lesson that comes from that, from this endeavor, is that on the one hand, this kind of collaboration can lead to a really fruitful alliance, like including Russia, like including this thing, but also an exclusion of that can also spur a space race or a technological race that could also be detrimental. And now, so in some sense, we are seeing both of those things play out from via International Space Station.
Yeah, but I would have thought that the lessons from the International Space Station would be that what we need is to not exclude any
Right,
nation.
exactly. Yes.
I mean,
Yeah.
the lessons are so
Yeah.
positive,
Yeah.
you know, that the lesson would have been to not exclude any nation and have a collective space station. I mean,
No.
yeah,
And these are the type of questions that are going to come up very soon, because Artemis, they are planning on building a station on the lunar south pole, and so is China, and Chinese alliance, right? And so how does that play out? I think those are all questions that are going to be crucial. Yeah.
Okay,
So
there's
yeah, go
one.
ahead, Sam.
Okay, I
Yeah, go
think
ahead, please.
we have received an interesting perspective on this subject and prospect for cooperation, prospect for competitions, but from diplomacy and geopolitical perspective, I think is going to be quite challenging to apply the lesson from ISS to lunar exploration, knowing fully well that ISS does not really involve profit making. There's no resources or oil or anything derived from an ISS. The fact that mineral resources are buried on the surface of the moon, under the surface of the moon, will make it quite challenging for corporation because whoever get there first will start exploration, and because of that, those that follows will have to find their own place to start exploration, and this is going to generate competition and possible conflict. It may not be harm conflicts, but it will generate disagreement among great powers. And again, uh, the space to the moon is not only reduced to US and China, it involved a lot of private actors within these
Yeah.
countries. Some of them that have already received license to explore different parts of the moon, asteroid, and some of them have been involved in years of research and development, preparing to explore at the moon. So this will complicate the matter and make it quite challenging because I wonder if a US company is first to locate a particular resources under the guise of cooperation. I don't know how easy it will be for the US to allow even partner country like UK, European countries to jointly mine the resources. And again, if US is the one providing the launch vehicle and the lander for the mission, I don't know the extent of decision making that will be granted to partner countries. So these are concerns and questions that will make cooperation very challenging, but they are not unsurmountable. Going back to history, I think we may need to go back to history of colonialism, as earlier mentioned, to draw some lesson and to look at what we need to avoid. Uh, we, Looking at the history of colonialism in Africa, for instance, so many parts of Africa moved from one hand to the other before the former Berlin Conference was called to demarcate territory. So now that will go against the spirit of no claims to territoriality in space. And there's no way a country will invest so much resources into exploration, into settlement, and maintaining settler on the moon without adding protective layers, without bringing police or any defense force or any defense equipment. And this will generate concern. We start militarizing the moon race by installing few equipment that can be converted for defensive and offensive purposes. And from there, the geopolitics may heat up. These are concerns that we need to look into. Are we going to revise the principle of no claims to territoriality? If we want to revise the principle, definitely it's not possible, or I think it will be quite challenging for the US to land somewhere and for Chinese to land in the same spot within the same radius with the current geopolitical tension between the two. Again, if it is possible to land in the same location, how will the situation in South China Sea and the growing tension and possibility of military confrontation affect such cohabitation or cooperation outside the planet or on the moon or elsewhere? So these are concerns. These are issues that need to be discussed, that need to be interrogated. We need to plan ahead to explore possible strategy, possible means to cohabitate and to cooperate and minimize the influence of geopolitical competition here on Earth, on the moon. And again, how will the global south or the majority of the countries that fall into the category of aspiring space nation as well as emerging space nation, how will their interest be carried along in the interest of the leading space players that are investing huge resources? How would this resource question be addressed? From the history of colonialism, there was cases whereby the British Empire licensed or approved some companies to start the mission of colonizing some part of Africa. In the case of the Niger Company, the Royal Niger Company, so it was later that the British troops supported the mission of the companies, and this shows similar trend in what we are witnessing in the moon. Many of these countries are pushing their firm to carry out research to prepare for exploration in the moon on the moon. Then the military defense have to be ready to protect their interest. So these are
Yeah.
questions of geopolitics, military strategy, diplomacy beyond science and technology that we need to answer. Thank you for now.
Yeah. Well, so this gets us back to. I mean, I want to conclude with the last question and, to the panel, but this brings us back to this issue of values to a certain degree, because you mentioned that private companies are deeply involved, which is true right now. And a couple of us are here are astronomers as well, so we are really concerned, like, because the moon is a great place to do astronomy, but it has to be protected, because if you have a bunch of satellites going around, or there is a lot of construction going around, or regolith being lifted up, you cannot do astronomy, right? So there is a question. This is a question for humanity in some sense. Okay, what do we value? Can we Moon is a very special place for astronomy, that the kind of stuff that you can do is the only place that you can do it in the solar system, or at least in the nearby solar system. But if private companies come in, you cannot do that. So sometimes the issues are diametrically opposite, right? But what you said about that, once you have private space companies, so yeah, there is an investment in it, then you need to protect the investment, then you need the militarization, and so on and so forth. So it goes back to the question, I mean, in some sense, to the International Space Station as well. And I think that's a great point. It doesn't make money. And so it doesn't have the same type of thing. Can we make Moon as a place which is not a place for corporate exploitation, right? Now, right now it looks like, well, it's very hard, but that's a question, right? I mean, like, do we allow, or do we think should this should happen, like, that we go like, okay, well, private space companies are going to go and exploit. When they're going to exploit, because they are putting resources in, they need to make profit. Well, if they're going to make profit, if there's competition, then you need to have actually protection of those spaces. But who gets to decide that they should go and exploit in the first place, right? I mean, I think we are in this point, and that's where the colonial history, for example, is really good case, because all of us come from places which have been impacted by colonial experience, and we know how even companies like British East India Company, they come in, and then what follows. So my last question, I think, dovetails on that, and that is, the moon is important to all cultures. Almost every culture has some relationship to the moon. But as we are seeing, like, that there are few countries that have access to it, going there. There are also few companies that have access to it. So exploitation angle that comes in. How do we, and I don't think we can come up with a solution right now in the next 10-15 minutes. But how do we think we should build a framework, or think about building a framework of bringing broader voices? And since we are talking about the global south, so broader voices from the global south, because one challenge that comes in, which is, I think, very specific in some ways to the global south, and some of the things that we talked about, is that there are space agencies, but space agencies are aligned, or oftentimes are aligned with either China or with the US and things like that. So one question is, what the space agency says. Do we say that, okay, well, space agency of Brazil, does it speak for the people of Brazil? That's one part of the question, right? Or how do we know what the broader population wants? And then how can we make sure that the broader voices of humanity are included in deciding the future of humanity on the moon? So how do we even think about that? How do we even start thinking about that? So yeah, I know it's a very broad and abstract question, but I think that's how should we think about that? How should we bring global south voices to it?
I mean, maybe one way is to have a really big ask, to say that the cosmos should be for knowledge generation. So the moon should be for knowledge generation. And which would sort of, like you said, just make many of the other problems go away. And I think there it is really important for us to remember both the fact that NASA, I mean, it was a watershed moment when the US decided that NASA would be a non military organization.
It's true.
And India's space program also originated in the idea of bringing the fruits of science and the technology to the largest number of citizens. And there are many success stories there. And also, it's true that, truly public institutions in a democracy have the door open for course correction. So when there is evidence that something is not going the right way, it is possible to course correct. But the moment you have all the pathways just feeding the sort of profit for the few, then a lot of those doors get closed. So, for example, space debris. It is not a problem that just needs some tech fix to clean it up. It is a symptom of the larger problem that we have been talking about in the last uh, so many minutes. And it is the same case for the environmental crisis on Earth. And so, whether it is the environmental crisis or the space debris crisis or the loss of our beautiful sky, they're all, sort of consequences of actions by profit-driven global minority paradigms. And so, I think it's actually very heartening to see some voices from the indigenous peoples of the world, of which there are a significant number even in the global south. And it's important, I think, for us to push back on the narrative that theirs is somehow an unscientific voice. Because actually, theirs is a voice that comes from a very different set of values, unlike the profit for the few centric values that threaten to take over the world. So the immediate need is to build a collective platform, I think, which can emphasize these because their value. I think we need that paradigm shift that humanity and human beings, we should see ourselves as custodians of the earth and custodians of our space environment rather than its owners, right? Because, whether legalistic owners or commercial owners, because both of these are sort of social constructs. And we, I think, need that paradigm shift away from conquest and towards knowledge creation. That would be sort of my
Yeah.
take.
And I should mention, actually, this is a paper. I'm going to actually provide a link for that as well, which I think came out last year. A call for indigenous partnership in the return to the moon, Tavares et al. And this actually argued again. So this is a broader partnership, and I also think, I mean, part of it is parallel, of course, to the AI aspect, that AI
Yeah,
is going in, and there is, we think of things as inevitable. I mean, there is this
yeah,
built-in AI.
yeah,
That's the way it is. Yeah,
yeah,
it's not great, but that's the
yeah,
sort of like the sort of like, whatever the momentum and things like that. Well, I'm sorry, but it's inevitable. I think, again, what we are talking about, like, that, okay, the moon, private companies are going, and so we have to try to avoid this inevitability paradigm, right? I mean, like, that, well, it's
yeah,
SpaceX is going to go. What can you do? Okay, so, okay, let's carve out whatever is left over from it, rather than a much broader response to that. Well, there are a lot more people who might think of a moon not as a property, not as a place to exploit, but as a heritage, for example, natural heritage or whatever. That would change things in that sense. So I think we lost Prajval's connection. But in the meantime, Ram or Sam, any sort of like, thoughts regarding that?
Yeah. Yeah. I absolutely agree. I think the voices that have been dominant, that are dominant in these conversations, governments, like Sam was saying, the agencies, the policymakers, the private companies, and the investors, right? So these are the voices that have been advocating for a certain future for space exploration, for lunar exploration, and so on. But if we have learned anything, from working in astronomy sector for the last, I think, for lots of years, is that there are millions of people in the world who care about astronomy, who care about
Yeah.
space, and at least thousands of people. For example, if you look at the International Astronomical Union's global network, there's like hundreds of people, probably thousands, who are ready to contribute in so many different ways, whether for science engagement, whether to popularize science, and to sort of be the grassroots connections all across the world. And I think it's important to leverage this sort of grassroots network, not just the IAU, but I'm sure there's other
Yeah.
networks around the world. And I think these are the people we should sort of lean on from the beginning in thinking about any frameworks and thinking about any future exploratory systems for the moon. And of course, it's not just about the moon. The moon is just
Yeah.
a stepping stone for the US and many other countries. And I'm sure once the genie's out of the bottle, it'll next be, mining Mars and mining asteroids and whatnot. So I think we need to create that groundswell movement, that grassroots campaign, where people's voices are at least heard and people understand, and sort of consent to whatever everyone decides. It can't just be a few companies and a few countries deciding what's best for everyone.
And a flip side of like the dark sky movement. And so dark skies, I mean, this is again one of those things that impacts everybody. But people are realizing the value of the dark sky, not just for astronomy, but also for ecology, and also a movement that, and for health in general, but
Yeah.
also that, well, it should be considered as a heritage of humanity. It's important to all of us. And again, that is flipping the script of that, right? I mean, I know that you want to have more and more lights, you want to have more and more stuff, but on the other hand, if a large segment of the world's population says, actually, no, it is important to protect the sky, it is important to protect the night sky, then that could be important. So I mean, I think this is the type of thing that can happen.
Yeah.
This is the type of thing that there could be examples for that. Sam, any final thoughts on your end? How do you think
Okay,
about
thank
this?
you so much. I agree with some of the recommendation that has been made, especially on issue of building grassroots movement to demand for transparency and accountability.
Yeah.
But we need to also go beyond grassroots. We need to strengthen the United Nations to
Yeah.
prepare for the coming future. Uh, in most cases, the common people, the general population, only have access to information that is made available to them. So the
Yeah.
grassroots movement
Yeah.
can be misled by misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda. So it's possible to weaponize information that is available to the general public, which the
Yeah.
grassroots movement will build on. So the United Nations will need to play a major role here in trying to work on transparency and openness, because there's no way to confront and fight a company that only have access to information they provide to the public. We cannot rely on a company or rely on a government that we seek to demand transparency and accountability from, and rely on them solely for our source of information. So there's a need to strengthen the United Nations in this context for transparency and accountability. It's clear that with the current pace of things, the US and China will be on the moon in the coming in the next few years. The two of them will have to rely on them to provide information on whatever they see there. It's quite difficult for us to insinuate that this is what they have access to. And it's only the two of them or those that have access to the moon that can confirm what they are doing or seeing there. So, and that's why the transparency demand have to go
Yeah.
beyond grassroots. Again, we need coalition of global South countries to play the kind of role they played during the Cold War in demanding for ban Although some of these countries are not involved in the negotiation, but they play critical role in pressurizing the great power to meet and negotiate on to reduce and end nuclear proliferation, especially testing of nuclear weapon. So that's very important. Some of these grassroots movement, we need to rely on countries that are key on transparency and accountability. And this Global South coalition can actually help to build that support base that the United Nations require to strengthen its framework, as well as that the grassroots require to demand for accountability. Because if you cannot rely on the two major powers or the leading powers, the leading space player to source for your information, you need countries that the only thing, countries like these Scandinavian countries that are so much concerned about peace and so on, they invest so much on this. Switzerland and the rest of them can be at the forefront front of this demand. And global South country can work with countries like that, countries like Canada that are so keen about environmental protection and so on. The global South country can build coalition that transcend the global South to the global North, because it's not all these countries in the global North that are also leading space player. Some of them are also in the category of aspiring emerging space player. They may have years of experience, but in time of leading the frontier beyond the Earth's immediate environment, some of them don't have that capability. So they can share the same interest and aspiration with the global South in demanding for accountability and in protecting the future of humanity and shared future in space. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, that's a really excellent point, and again, bringing in the historical context as well of the role of the global South in putting pressure coalitions before, and again, so nuclear disarmament aspect is another. Not that it was that successful, but it was enough to actually stop a little bit. So, I think these are all these things. I mean, we just and so this is again, as I said, I mean, this is not to find solutions immediately because these are not easy questions to answer, but I think there's a lot of stuff that we can actually take from it. So I would say thank you so much for your time and your insight, and let's continue this conversation. I mean, I think we need to have thinking about the framework. I mean, we just talked bunch of different ways, both from historical analogies, current analogies, and also in terms of thinking, especially from the colonial perspective. I think let's I'm a little more hopeful than before I started. Like, I mean, I think there can be something that the moon can be protected for the broader humanity. So let's see. So thank you so much, everyone, and I will keep you up to date if next panel when it happens, next conversation that happens. Thank you so much.